Built in 1928 by oil magnate Edward Doheny, the mansion is associated with a series of mysterious events, including the tragic deaths of his son, Ned Doheny, and his secretary, Hugh Plunkett, in 1929. The circumstances surrounding their deaths remain controversial, with some claiming it was a murder-suicide, while others suggest foul play. Over the years, Greystone Manor has gained a reputation for being haunted, with reports of strange noises, unexplained shadows, and eerie encounters. Visitors and staff have claimed to hear footsteps, doors slamming, and voices, as well as sightings of ghostly apparitions. The haunting has made the manor a popular location for ghost hunters and paranormal investigators. As the years went by, the tragic deaths of Ned Doheny and Hugh Plunkett became a whispered legend. Greystone Manor, once a symbol of wealth and opulence, became a place shrouded in fear and curiosity. The mansion's grandeur, with its sweeping staircases, grandiose rooms, and meticulously manicured gardens, only seemed to magnify the sorrowful energy that hung in the air. It was said that, late at night, the mansion would come alive with strange noises, the sound of footsteps echoing down empty halls, the faint rustling of curtains in rooms where no one dared to enter. Staff members who had worked at the manor reported that their radios would often flicker on by themselves, playing static or distorted music from another time. The once beautiful marble floors seemed to creak under the weight of an invisible presence. The stories of ghostly apparitions in the windows were just the beginning. Some visitors who dared to stay overnight claimed to have seen the figure of a man, pale and disheveled, standing by the grand staircase. Others spoke of a woman in a white dress, weeping by the fountain, her face hidden behind the veil of her hair. But the most disturbing sightings were of the two figures that had died at the manor, Ned and Hugh. Their spirits, many believed, were still trapped within the estate, restless and seeking answers to their untimely deaths. Then, one fateful night, a renowned paranormal investigator named Isabelle arrived at Greystone Manor, determined to uncover the truth behind the haunting. Isabelle, known for her calm demeanor and skeptical nature, had debunked many ghost stories in her career, but she felt an unusual pull toward this case. Armed with the latest equipment, thermal cameras, EVP devices, and night vision goggles, she set up camp in the manor's grand dining room, which was said to be the epicenter of the most intense paranormal activity. As the clock struck midnight, a chill ran through the room. The temperature dropped rapidly, and a soft whisper echoed in the air. At first, Isabelle thought it was the wind, but then, as her camera flickered to life, she caught a glimpse of something moving just beyond the lens. She turned, expecting to see one of her colleagues, but no one was there. A shadowy figure appeared near the grand chandelier, its form unclear but its presence undeniable. Isabelle's heart raced as the air grew heavy with an oppressive weight. She turned to her EVP device, hoping for a sign, a voice, anything. Suddenly, the room was filled with static, and then, unmistakably, a voice, a deep, guttural whisper cut through the silence. "Help us! Find the truth!" The temperature dropped even further, and Isabelle's breath turned to mist in the air. As she stepped forward, the ground beneath her feet trembled slightly, as if the very foundation of the manor was shifting. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, she felt the presence of another figure, watching her from the shadows. As Isabelle ventured deeper into the mansion, the whispers grew louder, and the strange occurrences more frequent. Each step she took seemed to bring her closer to something she couldn't quite understand. And with each passing moment, it became clear that whatever spirits lingered here were not merely seeking to communicate, they were trying to warn her. But what were they trying to warn her about? Could the deaths of Ned and Hugh have been something more sinister than anyone realized? And, more unsettling still, was the manor itself hiding a deeper secret, a secret that, once uncovered, could shatter the very fabric of reality? The answers, it seemed, lay hidden in the walls of Greystone Manor, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to uncover them. But Isabelle had no idea that by entering the manor, she had unknowingly crossed into a realm where the boundaries between the living and the dead were not just blurred, they were breaking down. And as she uncovered more of the manor's dark secrets, she would learn that some things, some forces, are not meant to be disturbed. Isabelle's heart pounded in her chest as she moved deeper into the manor, her flashlight trembling in her grip. The whispers had grown louder, now unmistakable, coming from all directions. Help us, find the truth. But they were not just voices. They were voices mixed with strange, almost mechanical distortions. As if something or someone had been trying to speak through a broken radio. Their words fractured, as though they had been stuck in this space for far too long. In the dim glow of her flashlight, Isabelle could see something unsettling. The walls of the dining room, where she had started her investigation, had begun to warp. The once pristine wallpaper curled at the edges, as though the very structure of the house was trying to expel the memory of the events that had transpired within. The temperature continued to drop, and Isabelle found herself shivering, her breath visible in the air. But it wasn't just the cold that unnerved her, it was the feeling of being watched. She stopped dead in her tracks. A low creak sounded from above, as though something heavy was moving in the attic. Isabelle's instincts told her to leave the room, to get out of the house, but there was something powerful pulling her deeper into the manor. She felt an irresistible force guiding her toward the stairwell that led to the second floor. Her pulse quickened as she ascended the stairs, each step making the floorboards groan under her weight. As she reached the landing, she noticed something that froze her in place. At the end of the hallway stood a door, slightly ajar, a faint light flickering from within. But it wasn't the light that made her blood run cold, it was the shape of the doorway itself. The edges of the door were distorted, as if the space around it had been twisted out of alignment. The hallway itself seemed to curve, as though the house was playing tricks on her mind. Isabelle approached cautiously, her feet moving almost involuntarily toward the light. Her EVP recorder in her hand flickered, and then, just as she reached for the door, the light suddenly flickered out. Silence fell. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, she pushed the door open. Inside, the room appeared abandoned. Dust covered every surface, and the furniture was old and faded. But what caught Isabelle's attention wasn't the room itself, it was the mirror on the far wall. It was enormous, the glass framed in ornate gold, and it reflected nothing but the empty room. Or so it seemed. When Isabelle stepped closer, she realized something strange. The reflection in the mirror was not right. It was as if the mirror's surface was shifting, flickering between moments in time. In one instance, the room looked as it did now, abandoned, dark, and decaying. But in the next moment, it was brightly lit, the furniture pristine, and a figure stood before the mirror, a man, his face obscured by shadows. Isabelle's breath caught in her throat. She stepped back, and the reflection in the mirror rippled. For a split second, she thought she saw the face of Ned Doheny, his eyes wide with fear, his mouth moving as though he was trying to say something. But the image vanished just as quickly as it had appeared. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from behind her. The door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. Isabelle spun around, her heart racing. She was no longer alone in the room. A shadowy figure stood in the doorway, taller than any man she had seen before, its features obscured by an unnatural darkness. It moved with an eerie grace, its presence filling the room with a sense of overwhelming dread. Isabelle tried to call out, but no sound came from her mouth. Her body felt frozen, as if the very air around her had become thick with an otherworldly energy. The figure took a step forward, and the room seemed to tremble. The walls groaned, as if they, too, were trying to resist its presence. Isabelle felt the oppressive weight of something ancient and powerful press against her chest, and for a moment, she was sure that her heart would stop. But then, the figure spoke, a voice low and guttural, like 1,000 whispers layered on top of one another. "You shouldn't have come here. The truth is not meant for you." Isabelle took a step back, her breath ragged. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head, and for the briefest moment, Isabelle saw its eyes pale and hollow, like twin pools of darkness. "I am the keeper of what lies beneath this house, the one who remembers what they want to forget." Suddenly, the floor beneath her feet began to tremble violently. Isabelle stumbled as the walls began to shake. A harsh, grinding noise filled the air, and before she could react, the entire room seemed to warp, its edges bending, the floor rippling like water. The mirror shimmered once more, but now it reflected more than just the room. It showed another scene, a man in a suit, holding a gun to his head, his face filled with anguish. A memory or a warning? The figure moved toward Isabelle with inhuman speed, its voice growing louder, more frantic. It was never meant to be this way. They never should have found it. The figure reached out with elongated fingers, its touch cold and suffocating. Isabelle's mind raced. What had the figure meant by what lies beneath? Was it tied to the mysterious deaths of Ned and Hugh? And how was it connected to the strange distortions in the house? With every fiber of her being, Isabelle knew one thing: whatever she was uncovering was not just a ghost story. There were forces at work in Greystone Manor that were ancient, dark, and far more powerful than she could have ever imagined. As the figure's hand reached for her, the last thing Isabelle saw before the world around her shattered was the image in the mirror, the gunshot. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The mirror shattered, its jagged pieces scattering across the floor like broken memories. The figure in the doorway was gone, but the room continued to warp, bending reality in ways that Isabelle couldn't comprehend. The walls now seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as though the house itself was alive, breathing, waiting. Isabelle stumbled backward, her mind racing. The air around her was thick, oppressive, and she could hear a low, throbbing hum emanating from the very foundation of Greystone Manor. It was as if the house itself was calling to her, urging her to delve deeper, to uncover the truth that had been hidden for so long. But she could feel the danger now, more keenly than ever. Something dark and ancient lurked in the very heart of the manor, something that had been waiting for someone like her to arrive. Suddenly, the floor beneath her feet began to tremble again. But this time, it wasn't just the house that was shifting. The walls around her seemed to move, warping inward, as if reality itself was being sucked into a black hole. Isabelle reached out, grasping for anything stable to hold on to. But the room was folding in on itself, the edges blurring and becoming indistinct. Her flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the room, and then everything went dark. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat. She had fallen to the floor, but when she looked up, the room around her had completely changed. The walls were no longer decayed and abandoned, now they were pristine, as if they had been restored to their former glory. The furniture gleamed, the curtains fluttered in a soft breeze, and a faint golden light filtered through the windows, casting an almost surreal glow over the room. But something was off. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror, much like the one that had shattered. This mirror, however, was intact, its surface clear and still. But as Isabelle gazed into it, she saw not her reflection, but something else, something familiar. It was a vision of a woman, young and vibrant, standing in the hallway just outside the room. The woman's face was obscured, her back to the mirror, but Isabelle could sense something deeply unsettling about the image. The woman stepped forward, her footsteps echoing through the empty house, and as she moved closer to the mirror, her face became visible. Isabelle's blood ran cold as she recognized the face. The woman was her. But this version of herself was different, older, more weathered, with an expression of sorrow and fear that Isabelle didn't recognize. The woman in the mirror raised her hand, reaching toward the glass as if trying to pull herself out. Isabelle's heart raced. What was this vision? How could it be her? And why did it feel so wrong? Before she could process what was happening, the door behind her creaked open. She turned to find the same shadowy figure standing in the doorway once more. This time it didn't speak. It just watched her, its hollow eyes filled with an unreadable, suffocating presence. Isabelle's legs trembled, her instincts screaming at her to run, but her body refused to move. The figure tilted its head, and in an instant, the woman in the mirror moved, her face contorting in agony, her mouth open in a silent scream. The reflection seemed to stretch, as if the very fabric of the room was being torn apart by the force of her presence. The woman's fingers pressed against the glass, her eyes wide with panic. She was trying to warn Isabelle, trying to tell her something. Suddenly, the figure in the doorway stepped forward, its form flickering in and out of existence like a shadow cast by an unseen light. It reached out, and Isabelle felt a cold, unnatural chill grip her heart. The figure's hand hovered just above her head, as though it were measuring something, waiting for the right moment. And then it spoke. "The past is not gone. It has only been waiting." The words were like a cold wind, cutting through her mind. Isabelle's thoughts raced. What did it mean? The past is not gone? Was the house somehow trapped in time? Was this mansion haunted not just by spirits, but by history itself, by memories that refused to fade? Before she could react, the room began to shift again. This time, the air grew heavy with the scent of decay. The pristine walls darkened, and the flickering light in the room turned to an unsettling red, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to reach for Isabelle. The woman in the mirror screamed again, her face contorted in terror, but Isabelle could no longer hear her voice. Instead, the room filled with the deafening sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and drawing closer. Isabelle spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the presence of someone or something moving behind her. It wasn't the figure in the doorway. This was something different, something older, more insidious. The footsteps grew louder, and then a voice, one she recognized, whispered in her ear. "You shouldn't have come back." Isabelle froze. The voice was familiar. It was the voice of Ned Doheny. Her mind reeled. Ned? But how? How could he be speaking to her now, after everything that had happened? And then, a shadow appeared in the corner of the room, standing just outside the edge of the light. It was him, Ned, or at least the shadow of him. His face was pale, his eyes empty, and his mouth twisted into an eerie grin. His body seemed to flicker like a mirage, shifting in and out of focus. "You've uncovered something, something buried too deep to unearth." His voice was filled with cold bitterness. "Now you'll never leave." Isabelle's breath quickened as she turned to run, but the house shifted again, its walls twisting and closing in around her. The doors had disappeared. There was no escape. The manor, it seemed, was alive, and it had claimed her. Her only choice now was to face the truth of Greystone Manor, to unravel the twisted web of its past, before it swallowed her whole. Isabelle's heart hammered in her chest as she sprinted through the narrowing hallway. The walls groaned, distorting and bending as though they were alive, reshaping the very house around her. She reached for the door, but the handle vanished as soon as her fingers touched it. The air was thick with an unnatural cold, and the oppressive weight of the house pressed down on her. Behind her, Ned's shadow flickered, always a few steps behind, its hollow, lifeless eyes never leaving her. His voice echoed in her mind, like a haunting refrain. "You've uncovered something buried too deep to unearth. Now you'll never leave." She couldn't escape. She was trapped. Suddenly, a voice, soft, almost melodic, spoke from the shadows. "Isabelle, don't fight it. It's too late for that now." Isabelle spun around, but there was no one there. The voice wasn't coming from the figure of Ned, but from the very walls, as if the house itself were speaking to her. The temperature dropped again, the cold seeping into her bones. The house seemed to be pressing closer, suffocating her, and the faint flicker of light from the mirror, the one that had shown her the woman. Her own face remained in her mind's eye. It was as if the house wanted her to remember, wanted her to understand. Without warning, the walls began to pull back, revealing a long-forgotten room at the end of the corridor. A door, one that hadn't been there before, stood ajar. The room beyond was dark, the only light coming from a strange, pulsating glow deep within. Isabelle could feel an invisible pull, as if the room was calling to her, beckoning her forward. She knew she had no choice but to enter. Her legs felt like lead as she approached the door. Her breath caught in her throat. She stepped inside. The room was dim, but Isabelle could make out the silhouette of an ornate desk, a dusty, ancient chair, and a strange, weathered book lying open. The glow came from the pages of the book, where strange symbols danced like flames. Isabelle stepped closer, her fingers trembling as she reached out. As she touched the book, a wave of energy surged through her, cold and electric, filling her mind with flashes of memories not her own. She saw the house as it had once been, alive with laughter, joy, and wealth, but also saw glimpses of the tragic events that had unfolded here. She saw Ned and Hugh, their fates intertwined in a web of deceit, corruption, and betrayal. And she saw something more, something darker. The symbols on the page began to shift and move, forming into a single word, one that Isabelle knew without question: covenant. The truth hit her with the force of a lightning bolt. The Doheny family had made a pact, a dark, unholy agreement with something that was not of this world. In exchange for power and wealth, they had promised the house Greystone Manor their souls. The spirits that haunted the manor were not just the lost souls of those who had died tragically, they were the prisoners of the house, bound by the covenant, trapped in a never-ending cycle of torment. Ned and Hugh were just the latest victims of this ancient deal, but the real horror was that the house itself was feeding off their suffering, growing more powerful with each soul it consumed. Isabelle's mind raced as the pieces fell into place. She had uncovered the truth, but now it was clear there was no escape from Greystone Manor. The house was alive and it was hungry. A deafening crash erupted behind her. She spun around to find the figure of Ned, now fully corporeal, his ghostly form towering over her, his eyes hollow and empty. He reached out, his hand cold and unyielding. "Now you understand," he whispered, his voice a twisted blend of pain and satisfaction. "You've seen what you shouldn't have, and now the house will claim you too." Before Isabelle could react, the walls closed in on her, the light from the book flickering out, plunging her into total darkness. And then, as if from a distance, she heard a voice that was both familiar and foreign. "You shouldn't have come back to this time, Isabelle." In an instant, the house fell silent. The temperature rose. The walls were still. And when Isabelle opened her eyes once more, she was no longer in the room with the book. She stood in the grand foyer of Greystone Manor. The air was still. The mansion was pristine. The heavy curtains were drawn, but the soft golden light that filtered through the windows made it feel alive again. No cold, no shadows, no ghosts. She was alone. But when she looked into the mirror by the grand staircase, she saw it. There was no reflection, only the faint outline of a woman standing behind her. Isabelle froze. Slowly, she turned, but no one was there. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew now. The house had claimed her. It was no longer just a haunted mansion, it was a prison, a living, breathing entity, and now she was part of its twisted past. The mansion had whispered its secrets, and now it had her. In Greystone Manor, the past was never truly gone. It was waiting, and Isabelle was its newest prisoner. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.